Welcome. I'm Victor Curran, and whether you are here in our sanctuary or watching us on Zoom or watching us on YouTube next week, I am delighted to welcome you on behalf of the Transcendentalism Council at First Parish in Concord. Our group plans and presents events that educate about and celebrate the people and events that made Concord the home of American imagination and independence. Our lecture series is rooted in the Lyceum movement of the 19th century, and the Concord Lyceum was started in 1828. And in its first 50 years, it presented almost 800 lectures. Ralph Waldo Emerson gave 100 of them. Reverend Barry Andrews is on track to become our Emerson. He's a longtime friend of First Parish and of Concord, and he's a member of the Thoreaus Society, and we are always happy to welcome him back. He's a retired Unitarian Universalist minister who has written about Transcendentalism and Transcendentalist authors, including Emerson, Thoreau, Margaret Fuller. His recent books include Transcendentalism and the Cultivation of the Soul, and American Sage, The Spiritual Teachings of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Tonight, he will invite us into his new book, The Gospel According to This Moment, The Spiritual Message of Henry David Thoreau, where he reveals how an idiosyncratic and unconventional religious faith was central to Thoreau's life. And he examines Thoreau as a spiritual guide who can teach us an alternative way of being religious in the world. Now, there are a couple of housekeeping things I want to mention. There will be a Q&A at the end of Barry's talk. If you are joining us on Zoom, use the chat button to ask your questions. And if you are joining us here in the sanctuary, raise your hand if you have a question and we will bring you a microphone. Don't ask your question without a microphone because all you nice people on Zoom won't hear it. Also, after the Q&A, there will be a reception downstairs in the parish hall. You get there from the steps over here on my right, your left. And we will also have copies of Barry's books available for sale and signing, including The Gospel According to This Moment. And I want to thank the Thoreaus Society shop and Karina Hosfeld-Smith for taking care of the book sales this evening. And if you are watching on Zoom, we will put a link in the chat to the Thoreaus Society shop website where you can get Barry's books there as well. So I think that's all the housekeeping that we need to take care of. So I would like to invite you all to join me in welcoming Barry Andrews.
Thank you, Victor, for that warm introduction. It's a pleasure for me to be with you this evening on this special occasion. And I want to also thank you, Victor, and Shelley Hawks, and the Transcendentalism Council of First Parish for sponsoring this meeting, and Corinne Smith of the shop at Walden Pond for bringing some books over for sale after the lecture. Also want to say thanks and welcome to our audience, both here in person and online with the Zoom presentation. occasion is special because Henry David Thoreau died on this date, May 6th, in 1862. His funeral was held here in First Parish. Since he'd signed off from the church many years before, it took place in the vestry rather than the sanctuary. Nevertheless, the current minister, Reverend Grendel Reynolds, participated along with Bronson Alcott, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and others. Alcott not only planned the service, but also arranged to have children dismissed from school so that they could attend. The bell rang 44 times as mourners entered the building. Emerson delivered a moving eulogy, concluding, "The country knows not yet, or in the least part, how great a son it has lost. It seems an injury that he should leave in the midst of his broken task, which no one else can finish. A kind of indignity to so noble a soul, that it should depart out of nature before yet he has really been shown to his peers for what he is. But he, at least, is content. His soul was made for the noblest society. He had, in a short life, exhausted all the capabilities of this world. Wherever there is knowledge, wherever there is virtue, wherever there is beauty, he will find a home." His coffin, accompanied by a procession of more than 300 school children, was carried to new burying ground across the street from the church. It was later moved to Author's Ridge in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery to rest near those of his friends Emerson, Alcott, and Hawthorne. Thoreau's reputation began to grow shortly following his death, as pilgrims and curiosity seekers alike began to beat a path to Concord and Walden Pond. In June 1872, Alcott accompanied Mary Adams, a visitor from Iowa, to a Unitarian picnic at Walden Pond. Along the way, he pointed out the location of Thoreau's cabin. She suggested placing stones at the site, since there was nothing else to indicate where the cabin had been. She laid the first stone, and some of the picnickers followed suit. The rude stones were a monument more fitting than the costliest carving of the artist, Alcott noted in his journal. Henry's fame is surely to brighten with years, and this spot be visited by admiring readers of his works. This cairn has grown steadily over the years as visitors continue to add their stones to it, many of them inscribed with a favorite Thoreau quote or something more personal. Recently voted the most popular state park in Massachusetts, the pond and cabin site attract well over 500,000 visitors a year. The Visitors Center at the pond houses a Thoreau exhibit and a bookshop run by the Thoreau Society, the nation's oldest and largest literary organization. The Society hosts an annual gathering in July, bringing together scholars and Thoreau fans from all over the world. The Walden Woods Project, founded by rock musician Don Henley, established a study center, and the Thoreau Institute, a state-of-the-art library housing a significant collection of materials for scholarly research. Pilgrims who are drawn to the pond cannot fail to feel Thoreau's presence there. As one notable visitor, Lauren Isley, described his experience, "I had emerged on the path as followed by the author of Walden. The eye was everywhere, and as for Walden, it too was everywhere that the eye existed." Thoreau's influence today extends far beyond the shores of Walden Pond. Walden has been translated into every major language, most recently Iranian and Icelandic. His writings have been the focus of international conferences held in France, Sweden, Iceland, Japan, and other countries. Studies of Thoreau's writings have been published by scholars in Britain, Germany, France, Sweden, Bulgaria, Japan, India, Russia, Iran, Iceland, and elsewhere. Thoreau himself was a global thinker who drew upon ancient and modern wisdom from the East and West. Although he's widely known and appreciated today, his reputation was slow to develop. Until late in the 20th century, it rested primarily on Walden, his best-known book. With the posthumous publication of essays in the Atlantic Monthly and his books Excursions, The Maine Woods, Cape Cod, A Yankee in Canada with Anti-Slavery and Reform Papers, he began to attract greater attention. Late 19th century nature writers John Muir and John Burroughs paid tribute to his influence. A succession of naturalists, during the 20th century, including Joseph Wood Crouch, Edwin Way Teale, Annie Dillard, have also acknowledged his importance. As Teale, a past president of the Thoreau Society, wrote, "Running through all of Thoreau's writings, running all through his life, is the intensity of his feelings for nature, for wildness. To few people in the world has nature meant us so much as it did to Thoreau." With the closing of the American frontier in 1890, the public perception of wilderness gradually changed. Where once wilderness needed to be tamed, now it needed to be preserved. Here, too, Thoreau's influence is apparent. He had called for the preservation of wild areas in several of his writings, most notably in The Maine Woods and Walking. As the environmental movement gained strength during the 20th century, it became clear that something more was called for. In the view of Roderick Nash, author of Wilderness and the American Mind, the future of wilderness on Earth depended as never before on the promulgation of a convincing philosophy. He credits Thoreau and the Transcendentalists with providing the needed philosophical rationale. Transcendentalism was one of the major factors conditioning Thoreau's ideas regarding nature, he writes. The core of Transcendentalism was the belief that a correspondence or parallelism existed between the higher realm of spiritual truth and the lower one of material objects. For this reason, natural objects assumed an importance because, if rightly seen, they reflected universal spiritual truths. As a way of thinking about man and nature, Transcendentalism had important implications for the meaning of the American wilderness. For Thoreau and the Transcendentalists, reverence for nature went hand in hand with living simply. Naturalist John Burroughs, an early champion of Thoreau's philosophy, drew the connection between the two. There can be little doubt, I think, but that intercourse with nature and a knowledge of her ways tends to simplicity of life. We come more and more to see through the follies and vanities of the world and to appreciate real values. We load ourselves up with so many false burdens. Our complex civilization breeds in us so many false or artificial wants that we become separated from the real sources of our strength and health as by a gulf. Today, Thoreau is as well known for his advocacy of simple living as for preserving wild places. Writings such as Walden and Life Without Principle have given impetus to a variety of social reforms resting upon two interrelated assumptions: the life-enhancing panacea of nature and the soul-degrading influence of materialism. The first is the remedy for the second. Thoreau was neither the first nor the only one to seek a way of living that reduced one's material and social needs to a minimum in order to pursue spiritual truths, moral ideals, and aesthetic impulses. What he and other transcendentalists called plain living and high thinking encompassed a wide spectrum of practices. Some, like Thoreau, sought solitude, living in the woods or by a pond. Others form cooperative communities like Brook Farm and Fruitlands. Such experiments are even more prevalent today, as witnessed in the widespread back to the land, tiny house, and voluntary simplicity movements. If Thoreau was not the first to advocate simple living, he is nevertheless credited with being a major inspiration for others to practice it in their own way. Though he was not known as an activist in his own time, his radical environmentalism, combined with his anti-slavery activities and his critique of materialism, have since called attention to the contemporary relevance of his political views. His essay on civil disobedience inspired Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and many others in passive resistance to social injustice and war. The essay also highlights the importance of active resistance to the complicity of individuals in society in racism and oppression. While it is often taken to mean that one should simply refuse to condone or participate in unjust actions, Thoreau's argument goes beyond that. As he wrote in Walden, moral reform is the effort to throw off sleep. One's accountability is not simply to opt out. It also entails a commitment to awaken to one's complicity in injustice and a willingness to make redress for whatever complicity one finds. In awakening to his own responsibility, he realized that he had to act against slavery and unjust war, even if it took him away from his treasured walks in the woods. His argument gains currency in the light of questions today concerning restorative justice, reparations, and white privilege. His influence is greater today in another respect as well. He is justly celebrated as an advocate for wilderness preservation, simple living, and action from principle. But the impetus for all three of these comes from his unconventional yet deeply felt spirituality, rooted in his experience of the natural world. Early biographers and critics focus on his nature writings and social commentary primarily. Within the academic community, this is largely true today. Even as scholars have begun to take a closer look at the religious views of the Transcendentalist writers, they mostly treat them either in the context of American intellectual and cultural history or that of church or social reform. Less attention has been paid to their impact on the interior affective life of his readers. Thanks in part to the work of a few scholars, including Alan Hodder and K.P. Van Anglen, it is becoming more respectable to focus on the spiritual dimension of Thoreau's writings. Hodder attributes the growing popular and scholarly interest in the spiritual Thoreau to the fact that he was among the first Americans to articulate and embody in a performative way an approach to being religious or spiritual that has become increasingly recognizable and even appealing to a large swath of Americans, particularly since the 1960s. In my view, it is precisely Thoreau's spiritual vision that so many of his readers find attractive. His ecstatic spirituality is the common denominator and motivating factor in all of his interests and commitments. And it is this which is of greatest interest to readers today. Studies continue to show that even as church membership and denominational affiliation have declined, Americans remain concerned with spiritual values, preferring to pursue them outside the context of religious organizations. They're best described as spiritual but not religious. Many consider themselves seekers for whom personal religious experience, often mystical in nature, occupies a central place in their spiritual life. Commonly dissatisfied with our materialistic culture, they seek a simpler way of life in harmony with nature. Given the fact that Thoreau quit the church he was raised in and was scornful of formal religion, It might seem odd that anyone might consider him a spiritual guide. But many of today's seekers have followed a similar path, questioning religious dogmas, rejecting the hypocrisy of churches, and embracing a religious cosmopolitanism. And many would agree with what he wrote in 1850. I do not prefer one religion or philosophy to another. I have no sympathy with the bigotry and ignorance which make transient and partial and puerile distinctions between one man's faith or form of faith and another, as Christian and heathen. I pray to be delivered from narrowness, partiality, exaggeration, bigotry. To the philosopher, all sects and all nations are alike. I like Brahma, Hari Buddha, the Great Spirit, as well as God. Like Thoreau, they have been drawn to other religious traditions and philosophies in search of wisdom, insights, and meaningful spiritual practices. What his readers find most compelling, frequently overlooked in academic treatments of his writing, is his gospel according to this moment. Thoreau went to Walden Pond, he wrote in his journal, hoping to leave his self behind and delight in the contemplation of his soul. When I hear the church bell ring, I am carried back to years and Sabbaths when I was newer and more innocent, I fear, than now. And it seems to me as if there were a world within a world. Sin, I am sure, is not in overt acts or indeed in acts of any kind, but it is in proportion to the time which has come behind us and displaced eternity. The whole duty of life is contained in this question, how to respire and aspire both at once. This is what Emerson referred to as the dilemma of double consciousness. On the one hand, we're caught up in the affairs of the everyday world with all of its distractions and demands. On the other hand, we are from time to time aware of a world within this hectic outer world that remains detached and centered while everything else goes spinning about. How to reconcile these two forms of consciousness is one of the fundamental challenges of the spiritual life, contained in Thoreau's apt expression, how to respire and aspire both at once. That is, how to find nirvana in samsara, eternity in the fleeting moment. It is to live fully in the present, or as Thoreau himself expressed it in another journal passage, nothing must be postponed. Take time by the forelock, now or never. You must live in the present, launch yourself on every wave, find your eternity in each moment. Fools stand on their island opportunities and look toward another land. There is no other land, there is no other life but this or the like of it. Take any other course, and life will be a succession of regrets. Let us see vessels sailing prosperously before the wind, and not simply stranded barks. There is no world for the penitent and regretful. To live fully in the present, we must leave ourself behind, Thoreau insisted. We don't know how deeply he studied the Hindu texts he read, but he knew well enough that there is a difference between the ego and the soul, and that the soul in each person is an incarnation of the oversoul, God, or the Great Spirit. And he was quite aware of the extent to which the ego gets in the way of our ability to find eternity in each moment. Following the advice of the Bhagavad Gita, he withdrew from the petty affairs of daily life to find a solitary place where he might live simply in contemplation and leisure. He left the village behind, but he knew he wouldn't succeed in cultivating his soul unless he left his petty self behind as well. Thoreau's spiritual life was devoid of doctrines or formulas or philosophical propositions. It was oriented around intoxicating experiences of joy in and oneness with the natural world. He often referred to them as ecstasies, or what we might call mystic states. These ecstasies begotten of the breezes came spontaneously and were not procured by him in any way. Such experiences assured him that he was dealt with by a superior power which sought to improve him and the quality of his life. At the same time, he was curious to know how it was that such light comes into the soul. William James describes mystical states as transient but compelling. Though fleeting, they are nevertheless, in his words, illuminations, revelations full of significance and importance, and carry with them a sense of authority. In Thoreau's case, as I suspect is true for most of us, these ecstatic experiences arose more naturally and occurred more often in youth than they did in adulthood. His journal, which he faithfully kept for most of his life, is as much an account of the ebb and flow of his ecstasies as they are a record of the local flora and fauna. As he grew older, Thoreau lamented the loss of such youthful ecstasies. Ah, the life that I have known, how hard it is to remember what is most memorable. We remember how we itched, not how our hearts beat. I can sometimes recall to mind the quality, the immortality of my youthful life, but in memory is the only relation to it. How to recall to mind not just the feeling of euphoria, but also the wisdom, the knowledge, the truth of what was most memorable in our lives. The world within a world is the most crucial issue and critical task of our own spirituality, and it was the central preoccupation of Thoreau in his adult religious life. During the 1850s, following his sojourn at Walden Pond, he gave his most sustained attention to the fundamental paradoxes of the spiritual life. Foremost among these is this: how do we command what is essentially spontaneous? Granted that these experiences are fleeting and at the same time central to our religious life and spiritual well-being, how, if at all, do we recapture them? Given that they are most likely to occur when the will is in abeyance, how is it possible to summon them? In his quest to discover how and whence it is that light comes into the world, into the soul, Thoreau was led to develop a spiritual practice that would enable him to leave his ego behind and allow him to respire and aspire both at once. As the frequency of these mystic states diminished, he was drawn to the idea that through a certain kind of regimen, he might put himself in a receptive frame of mind and thereby increase the odds that such experiences might recur. This regimen was in keeping with what was then termed self-culture, which the Transcendentalists took to mean the cultivation of the soul. If it was the self they meant to cultivate, it was the self in a larger, more spiritual sense, the self with a capital S, and not the narrow, limited self of the individual ego. It was this latter sense of self that Thoreau hoped to leave behind when he went to Walden Pond. Thoreau wanted his readers to find and follow their own path and not his or anyone else's. He insisted that people make hard choices, no doubt easier for him since he wasn't as enmeshed in relationships and commitments as most of us are. He never married, lived at home with his parents, and did odd jobs for a living. He could be difficult and exasperating, both for his friends and his readers. Behind the curtain, all saints and sages have their blemishes and foibles. Henry Thoreau is no exception. The question for us is whether or not his message has relevance today. Has society become so consumption-oriented, education so utilitarian, science so materialistic, and everyday life so consumed with social media and to-do lists that we ignore entirely the promptings of the Spirit? Is seeking ecstasies in the woods a frivolous pursuit in light of the serious problems we face, including homelessness, poverty, discrimination, and racism? Was Thoreau's living at Walden Pond a selfish retreat from society? Or did he have something to teach us about how we might enhance our lives and improve the lives of others with a due appreciation of the importance of solitude, nature, and self-reliance? The issues Thoreau addressed in his writing and in his person are perennial and universal in human experience: anxiety, alienation, prejudice, and a lack of meaning and purpose in life. In response to these, he continues to challenge us to live a life that is deliberately chosen rather than one laid out for us by others or simply fallen into and tolerated by a force of habit. As he declares in the spring chapter of Walden, it is possible that we might learn to live now instead of always postponing life and deferring to our duties, to atone for the sin of displacing eternity with the minutiae of everyday life, and to cease loitering in winter when it is already spring. By his own admission, Thoreau had no interest in recruiting followers, admonishing his readers to find and follow their own spiritual path instead. Many of them then and since have done so. While it might seem contradictory to suggest that he could be a spiritual guide for people today, I believe he has much to offer spiritual seekers, especially during these difficult times. As I write, we are living in the aftermath of a worldwide pandemic which has taken the lives of millions of people. At the same time, climate change is contributing to a dangerous combination of rising sea levels, drought, wildfires, and weather-related disasters. The nation continues to struggle with economic and racial injustice. We are also faced with the depletion of natural resources, species extinction, and mountains of waste due to unconstrained growth. In light of such challenges, it might seem that any advice from Thoreau is ineffectual and that comparing our world to his is unwarranted. But in fact, there never has been a period in our history without suffering, struggle, and hardship. During Thoreau's lifetime, the country experienced endemic poverty, 2 financial panics, wars of aggression against Mexico and native nations, the enslavement of 4 million African peoples, polarized politics, and the incurable disease of tuberculosis. Hence, withdrawing to Walden Pond might seem more like an escape than an answer, an accusation often made by his critics. In response to such criticism, Andreas Hess argues in a recent essay, Purposeful Solitude, Reading Thoreau in a Lockdown, that the dichotomy so often drawn between public engagement and private retreat is a false one. The 2 realms of public and private must not be seen as alternatives, but as as being coexistential, he writes. We cannot be engaged 24/7. We need to draw breath and recharge our batteries for the next struggle and the next public engagement. Critical reflection rarely happens when one is in the middle of a fight, but only with a distance both in terms of time and space. What Thoreau did was exactly that, a successful and thus recommendable experiment in shifting involvements. Thoreau's retreat to Walden Pond was strategic. It was not simply to get away and absolve himself of responsibility for the nation's problems. It was to disengage from conformity and complicity, to break the hold of an unhealthful and unjust social order on its citizens, and to rethink his position. In the process, he discovered for himself and demonstrated for others the importance of action from principle, simple living, and environmental sustainability. Nor was he simply chasing after rainbows and fleeting ecstasies. In moments of heightened awareness, he discerned the essential difference between the ideal world and the actual one, between what is important and what is merely superficial. What he learned from his experience, so eloquently expressed in Walden, was that if one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams and endeavors to live the life he has imagined, he will meet with a success unexpected in common hours. If you have built castles in the air, your work need not be lost. That is where they should be. Now put the foundations under them. He encourages us not merely to dream of a better world, but to create one. Finally, Thoreau instructs us in the art of life. For him, philosophy was not a matter of subtle thoughts and abstract propositions. It was a way of living. As such, it had much in common with ancient philosophies of India, China, Greece, and elsewhere. These philosophies were essentially therapeutic in nature. They were developed in response to the problems of living, including heartache, anger, despair, and loss. They counseled adherents to seek solace in nature, balance in life, and harmony with the universe. By means of spiritual exercises, followers were taught to distinguish between what contributes to human flourishing and what inhibits it. In my view, Thoreau offers his readers a similar philosophy, the gospel according to this moment, no less worthwhile than those of more ancient vintage. The disciplines he recommends, reading, solitude, contemplation, sauntering in nature, simple living, action from principle, and so on, are not simply congenial to today's spiritual seekers, but are also beneficial and rewarding. Thoreau has never been more popular than he is today. For years, he was dismissed as a loner, a misanthropist, and a shirker. To be sure, he had an aversion to small talk and could be standoffish. His criticism of his fellow citizens was sometimes caustic, and he was prone to exaggeration. While true enough, I suspect this criticism is intended to discredit his reputation and deflect attention from the imperative to live our lives more deliberately, as he has done and implores us to do. To be sure, he demands a great deal from his readers, including introspection, discipline, and perseverance. But he wants to assure us that we are not so stuck in our ways that we cannot change, and that life is full of possibilities. Like that beautiful bug he describes in Walden, which emerged from the dry leaf of an old table that stood in a farmer's kitchen, hatched from an egg deposited in the living tree many years earlier, Thoreau's wisdom has been buried under the dead weight of a society that prioritizes social conformity, conservative politics, and the exploitation of people and the natural world. Perchance this will be the summer that brings forth his beautiful and wicked thoughts at last. Thank you. Well, that was a mouthful. Thanks for bearing with me. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to hear them.
Yeah, David, we got, oh, good, these are working. All right. Has anyone got any questions? Greg?
What was the relationship of Thoreau and Emerson around the mystic insights that you say Thoreau had? Do you feel that they were kindred spirits in that regard?
Well, I think they were like-minded. Now, Emerson is a much more cerebral, intellectual writer than Thoreau is. I mean, Thoreau is certainly intellectual enough, but he's very concrete. He's not abstract in the way that Emerson was. But he learned a lot from Emerson. When he was still young, he walked all the way into Boston. Let's see, the lecture series of winter of 1837, I believe it was. Emerson was giving a lecture series on a human culture, essentially self-culture, and enumerated all the different aspects of that. Well, Henry walked all the way into Boston, in the snow, to hear him give the first of those lectures. And when Emerson heard what he had done, he invited Thoreau hear a reprise of those lectures that he gave in his own home here in Concord. So a lot of the ideas that Thoreau himself developed in relation to self-culture were inspired by Emerson. Now, Emerson was 17 years older, I believe, than Thoreau, and acted for a number of years as Thoreau's mentor until Thoreau, seeking to become a writer in his own right, sought to distance himself somewhat from Emerson. And in fact, he even had a falling out with Emerson over the failure of his first book, Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, and says some very disparaging words about Emerson. He thought Emerson encouraged him to do this, but didn't do enough to promote it, and so on. And there was a breach there for a number of years, several years for sure. It mended in time, but I think Emerson, in the end, learned as much from Thoreau as Thoreau did from Emerson. Yeah.
In reading about Thoreau being so influenced by some of the great wisdom traditions of the East, do we know, is there any good evidence that he had particular practices like a mantra practice or meditation or regular prayer? Did he do anything that you might call exercises to train the mind and so forth, in maybe a disciplined way that reflected the Eastern thought?
Well, at one point he said, I am a yogi. He was familiar with the yoga practices of Vedanta Hinduism, but he was not familiar with what we have come to know as the more physical practices, the asanas and so on. He had no instruction in that, and nothing he read really described that. But of course, the Bhagavad Gita is all about karma yoga. And I'd say, given Thoreau's involvements, his life out of doors and so on, and his work ethic, that you could easily consider that a form of karma yoga for him. He read everything that was currently available, but it was coming in bits and pieces from translations from France and England. Of course, he devoured the Bhagavad Gita and so on. I'm not sure he was able to put it all together, in the way that we can now, because we have a lot more scholarship and information about those traditions. But he was drawn to them, and I think he learned from them the importance of contemplation. Yeah.
Thank you, Victor. I work at the Concord Museum, and in my capacity as an interpreter there, I am often asked, what is Transcendentalism? Is it a religion? Is it a philosophy? Listening to you this evening, it seems as though you fall into the camp of Transcendentalism as a religion. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Well, I wrote a whole book on it. I'd say it was a way of life that was rooted in experiences of the natural world and inspired by wisdom traditions, East and West. It was, for want of a better phrase, spiritual but not religious. Now, most of the Transcendentalists, almost all of them, of the Transcendentalist circle, including Emerson and Theodore Parker and well, maybe 30 of them or so, they were all Unitarians or former active or former Unitarian ministers. So it did have a religious connection in that sense. But certainly for Thoreau and Emerson too, it was no longer grounded in historical Christianity. And in fact, I'd say they were looking for a vocabulary to describe their faith in ways that were different from what were the customary ways of relying on, church theology and that sort of thing. So to some extent they struggled with that because they were trying to find words to express it. And Thoreau himself thought that, he described it as trying to F the ineffable. It was a form of, I'd say, mystical epistemology, mystical insights. I think it would be hard for me to describe more fully without giving it, giving you another talk, but I hope that helps.
Another question over here.
Thank you for your writing about Thoreau and for this talk. I want to ask you, in a way, the same. There cannot be for Thoreau a tradition or even any ism. He put it in a way, I have everything to learn from the Indian and nothing from the missionary. And also, they are professors of philosophy, but not philosophers.
Right.
So today, at the present, he will not accept any ism, not even state church, academia.
Right.
These are absolute institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Tolstoy was influenced quite a lot
Right.
by Thoreau. And in this sense, do you think that the individual free soul, and he was called the first yogi, Henry David.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, the real yoga is that connection with whatever we might call it, God, cosmic consciousness, spirit,
Right.
without an institution or ism. So what I have heard that a priest or a pastor confronted him and said, it's time to make peace with God. And Thoreau replied, I don't remember ever quarreling.
Right.
That is the real yoga, that constant, it is meditation as a state of being, it's not as a practice.
Mm-hmm. Well, you expressed that very well.
Any other questions here?
Well,
I
let
have
me just say another word about
just a
that.
question over there. And then I have some questions that have come in the chat on Zoom.
Excuse me, let me say a word in response to what the gentleman had to say. I think you expressed that very well. Certainly, his faith was rooted in his experiences of the natural world. It was not rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition, even though he was perfectly familiar with the Bible and often cited biblical passages and so on. But what was most important for him, and he talks about it over and over again in his books and his essays, is elevation, how to get above himself, how to transcend his everyday preoccupations. And I guess commune with, with the oneness or God or however else you want to express that.
Thank you, Barry, for your talk. I'm wondering how Thoreau's later natural history studies and immersion in nature in the later 1850s influenced his spirituality.
Well, one of my favorite essays was Autumnal Hints, which was I think it was the last lecture he gave. I'm not sure about that, but it was certainly among the last, and it was finally printed in Harper's Magazine, or Atlantic Monthly, rather. He talks about the onset of autumn and how the trees come into their autumn colors. And he goes through them one at a time, the red, the orange, the yellow. And in the course of that essay, he's talking about old age. We think of old age as a matter of growing senescence, and that, we just kind of reach the end of our life and we die. But no, he points to those trees, and that they have this last flourish of life in the color that they put out. And he's suggesting that we too could, I guess, devote our senior years to further developing ourselves and leaving a legacy. Now, to me, that's a very spiritual essay. It's almost a sermon on old age and death. So, and a lot of his later writings are kind of in that vein. They're not so much talking about Stoicism or Vedanta or such, but they're more personal reflections on the everyday world and how he feels, connected to it and what he learns from it. I think you could say that about wild apples also. Yeah.
Question from an online participant, Claudia. And Claudia says she's coming from New Mexico, and she was interested in two things, the influence of Thoreau on Aldo Leopold, and also asked you the question, how does the gospel, according to this moment, inform your own spirit, Barry?
Okay, well, as far as Aldo Leopold is concerned, I've read some of his writings. It's been a while, so I don't remember the extent to which he might have mentioned Thoreau, but I think Thoreau initiated a lot of, in giving, in writing about nature so deeply as he did. I think he inspired a lot of people who followed him to also delve more deeply. Aldo Leopold certainly did, and he has that one image of the eye, isn't it, of a dying wolf, and he's looking into this eye and he feels a deep connection. Well, I think Thoreau felt that same deep connection. In Week on the Concord and Merrimack River, he talks about the dam on the Bellarica Dam and how it has blocked the migrations of the fishes upstream, including the shad. And he reflects on that, and he has that extraordinary line, "Who hears the fishes when they cry?" Well, that's kind of the same kind of empathy that he felt for the natural world that I think inspired other writers after him, like Burroughs and Muir and Aldo Leopold and others in that tradition as well. It's a sense of connection with the natural world that goes deeper than than I'd say even an appreciation of the natural world. Now, Thoreau has been with me all my life. 1963 was a very pivotal year for me. I was a junior in high school. I was aware to some degree of the world around me, but several things happened in the course of that year. One was an English teacher had us read Civil Disobedience. And I think for the first time I really started thinking about issues like that. And that was the summer of the civil rights demonstrations in Birmingham, Alabama. And you know, we saw, at least those of us who were around then, saw on TV the sheriff there sicking dogs and fire hoses on demonstrators. Martin Luther King Jr. was jailed in Birmingham. There was a bombing of a Birmingham church that killed four girls. So much happened that year, and I kind of all came together with my reading of Civil Disobedience, and of course, in the course of things, I found out how much that had influenced Martin Luther King Jr. and Tolstoy and Gandhi and others. Of course, it was also the year of the assassination of Kennedy. So that kind of got me going on it. And Emerson, Thoreau, and others talk about a Greek notion of a diamond, kind of a guiding spirit that comes into your life at birth and is with you throughout the course of your life. Well, Thoreau has been kind of a diamond to me, encouraging me in some ways, criticizing me in other ways, urging me in the direction of my life and ministry. So it has been, his influence has been felt very deeply over a long period of time. Now, I'm aware of what he says, don't follow me, follow yourself. So there's a bit of a irony in that, but I'll accept that. I'll just say that he's been very influential in my life and ministry. Well.
In his time, how radical was he perceived? How fringe-like was he by the mainstream, the townspeople of Concord? There's so much, because we had exposure, as you did in 1963 and I did in 1973. It's part of our upbringing, but at his time.
Well, the authority on Thoreau in Concord is sitting right here, Bob Gross. My impression was that he was something of a town gadfly. On the one hand, there were people who appreciated him for what he did. He was hardworking. He was a good surveyor, and I'd say, in his own way, a good citizen of Concord. But he wasn't always appreciated. He could be off-putting. He didn't suffer fools. He was usually very frank. Now, this is just what I've gleaned from my reading about him. I could be wrong. I mean, there are Concordians here, but I think it took Concordians a while to wrap their arms around Thoreau, because of course Emerson was the big fish. Thoreau, well, he might have been appreciated for any number of things, was not embraced, certainly not embraced to the extent that Emerson was. But I think now he's probably better known and more appreciated by virtue of the fact that he's better known than Emerson. And of course, Walden You know, the book has influenced so many people, and it's brought so many people right here to Concord and Walden Pond. So that's, you know, kind of his living legacy, I guess. I wonder, Bob, if you would say a few words about Thoreau in Concord in his day.
I think, in his own opinion, Thoreau thought of himself as a neighbor and strove to be a good neighbor. I mean, you can think of that when the townhouse was ornamented in, I think it was 1853 or 54, for Christmas. And the Concord Female Charitable Society sponsored this. The Christmas tree was, pine tree was put in the townhouse, and the women all made wrapped presents for every child in town. And then you read the accounts of it. Who went and cut down the tree but Henry David Thoreau from Walden? And I think that was the way in which he would probably most characteristically see himself, acting on his own to do something that he would see as benefiting the neighbors. And in that sense, you could say, ringing the bell to announce in 1844 the meeting of the Middlesex Anti-Slavery Society where Emerson spoke. Ringing that bell is of a piece with doing something to advance what he saw as the general good, help his neighbors, but not have to take on any binding commitments in the organization.
Thank you, Bob.
I didn't think I had a question, but listening to the questions and answers, I discovered I do. I was attracted to Thoreau's writings, first and foremost by the writing. And there's been some talk of disciplines and practices. And in my experience, writing is a discipline, and it is a practice. And there's a spiritual dimension to it. And I'm just wondering, where does Thoreau talk about writing? Or does he write about the act of writing? How does he feel about it? Does it link up with any of the questions about religion and spirituality that we've heard today?
Well, that's a good question, and I wish I had a good answer. Certainly he writes a lot about reading, you know, in Walden and elsewhere. To some degree, he talks about writing. I know in his essay about Carlyle, he talks about the importance of exaggeration. He says you must speak loudly to the hard of hearing, and that certainly comes through in his writing. He certainly has a way with words, and he's a great writer, but he doesn't talk... I can't recall reading much about where he's talking about writing. But wish I had a better answer. Walking, okay.
In a way, if we take the poet, like he was friend with both Emerson and Thoreau, Whitman, the poet sees and feels truth. The poet philosopher, Emerson, knows and understands truth. But the true person, as Henry David, like in the Tao Te Ching, the true person loves it and lives it. So in the wildness is the preservation of the world. And a little further, all good things are wild and free. So he was always free. And in writing, that shows.
Yeah, he's a great writer and an inspiring one. So why don't you join us downstairs?
Yes, thank you, Barry. And thank you all for your questions. So we invite you to join us for a reception downstairs in the parish hall, and there will be books for sale and signing there as well. Thank you very much.